I'm Reverend Wayne Arnason, and it's an honor to be able to deliver this year's 2025 Bellows Lecture here at All Souls Unitarian Church, reconstructing our Unitarian history, perils and possibilities. You know, history can be a fickle friend. The stories we tell about our ancestors constitute the foundations of our personal lives, our cultures, and our countries. We know who we are, and we understand our place and our purpose in the world in relation to our history. When that history is reconstructed, however, reconstructed because of new research and the unearthing of untold stories, it can be a jarring experience. Suddenly, old friends from history become people you don't know anymore, or no longer want to be associated with because of the new things that you find out about them. My personal history with my old friend Thomas Jefferson is a good example. Despite growing up as a Canadian UU, I knew that the words of the Declaration of Independence and the respect Jefferson had around the globe had made him the world's most famous Unitarian. So in 1984, when I became the minister at the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Church in Charlottesville, Virginia, Jefferson's hometown, I was thrilled by the chance to be associated with the Jefferson legacy. However, it wasn't long before that legacy started to feel tarnished by the well-known 200-year-old stories of Jefferson's life as a slaveholder and as a master to a young woman he owned and used as a concubine. I did my best to compartmentalize that information and hang on to my friend Jefferson. I acknowledged the inherent contradictions behind his inspiring words and the slaveholding identity that he had, but I chalked it up to being a man of his time. For far too long, I was oblivious to what it felt like to be a lifelong Black resident of Charlottesville, who grew up with a different personal history and with ancestor stories of courage and resilience in the face of oppression over many generations. Historians must always be open to reconstruction, even at the risk that a popular narrative that makes us feel good about ourselves is threatened. We have seen repeatedly around the world that in the short term, ideologies and politicians can change for a time how a history is told. And we are seeing that today in the current administration's efforts to remove from the public square American stories that are based in minority communities or identities. Historians understand that they can tell more than one story at one time. Different stories about our ancestors need not to be adjudicated as to which one is holding the whole truth. All of them can be understood as partial. It's always been a great joy in my writing about Unitarian Universalist history when I discover a new story about little-known ancestors whose relationships cast us in a different light. And that is the opportunity that I was offered when I proposed this Bellows Lecture. In the few months that I've been attending here at All Souls, I became quickly impressed with the love and care that you have devoted to telling the stories of your ancestors. They surround you when you walk into the sanctuary. And even though most, but not all, of those remembered on the walls are the clergy ancestors, you have balanced the scales of memory in your magnificent and beautifully presented 200th anniversary history book, All Souls at 200, in which many important lay leaders are remembered and honored. Few congregations in our faith have raised up consistent volunteers that together have made an achievement like All Souls at 200 possible. Nevertheless, all the histories of All Souls, those by Reverend Dr. Walter Kring and Mariella Holst-Zippel, as well as the 200th anniversary book, inevitably tell only a selection of stories, and tell those stories from a particular vantage point. It was Friedrich Nietzsche, in his 1874 work on the use and abuse of history for life, who described three forms that historical storytelling might take. The first form is monumental history, which emphasizes myths, actions, and belief in the great persons and events of the past, in the conviction that their emulation will be constructive to living a better life. And the walls of All Souls Sanctuary are an excellent representation of monumental history. The peril of the monumental approach to history is leaving out stories and characters that don't fit our heroic narratives. When monumental history creates literal monuments, like the many statues of Confederate war heroes that were lining Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, a decision to tear down those monuments becomes a symbol of a new and different understanding of the history we share. Must we tear down our monuments to tell more than one story? Sometimes we must, and that is what has happened across the South since 2017. But other times we can augment the monumental history with Nietzsche's second form, antiquarian history. Antiquarian history focuses on affirming personal and common life through an affirmation of common roots, traditions, and identities. Those of us who engage in personal genealogical research are engaged in antiquarian history. Black communities in the United States have long been practitioners and preservers of antiquarian history. The different sections of All Souls at 200 that document the stories of groups and programs and outreach at All Souls well beyond the narrative that is shaped only by the accomplishments of settled ministers could also be considered antiquarian history. Through the decades that I've been active in studying and writing history, we have been witnessing a modest revolution in how we tell the stories of American history that is captured in Nietzsche's description of the third form of history, critical history. Critical history seeks to be a liberating agent for those who have felt oppressed by the traditions of the past. From Howard Zinn and his 1980 People's History of the United States, all the way to 2018 and Jill Lepore's excellent American History Chronicle, These Truths, my own study of our Unitarian Universalist history has been profoundly influenced by these critical American historians. The recent Men's Lecture series for 2025, in which I participated, Demythologizing Unitarian Anti-Racism, was exactly this kind of critical history. Now, the approach that we have usually taken to teaching Unitarian history within our congregations has been monumental. Monumental storytelling serves us well in our church school curricula and adult programs because focusing on emblematic people who achieved or who represent major milestones gives us a brief and easy way to define the chapters of our common history. When we want to tell a different story or a new story, must this inevitably be heard as critical history? According to Jennifer Ratner Rosenhagen, writing in the Hedgehog Review, Nietzsche had his own doubts about critical history, arguing, and I quote, that the impulse towards critical history is driven by a zeal for condemnation, masquerading as impartial justice. These were the thoughts and the questions that I brought with me as I researched today's lecture. The story I want to tell you tonight is a reconstruction project, expanding and improving on the existing structure of all of the excellent work on All Souls history that has been done in the past. I see my offering tonight as more of an antiquarian contribution than a critical one. If I wanted to offer you a critical history lecture this evening about this church during the years surrounding World War II, then I would probably begin by saying that this is a religious institution that has mostly represented an upper class slice of the world that is New York City. All Souls was gathered by an overwhelmingly white, intellectual, and economic elite, characteristic, I will say, of most of the Unitarian congregations in the Northeast. As the church began its second century, it had the wealthiest membership among the 8 congregations in the 5 boroughs. Now, with a beginning like that, I could go on to tell a story that is filled with indisputable facts and true events and quoted statements that would do a good job of shaming and blaming the church for its inadequate response to various important issues over the years, described from the perspective of historically marginalized communities. But what I want to tell you instead is an antiquarian story, a story of 2 people's personal and common life within a shared Unitarian identity and shared careers as ministers that has not been found in All Souls history. It's the story of a relationship that was a familiar part of this church's life for 11 years between 1943 and 1954, but that has largely been forgotten and never researched. It's the story of the relationship between All Souls and the Harlem Unitarian Church as mediated through its ministers. In the same year that All Souls celebrated its 100th anniversary in 1920, a new Unitarian minister arrived in town and founded a congregation which ultimately became known as the Harlem Unitarian Church. It existed under different names and in different rented locations for the next 35 years, meeting during the latter years of its existence at the Harlem YMCA building, just a few subway stops to our north on 135th Street. If you wanted to research the history of Unitarianism in New York City, and you relied on the various histories that have been published about All Souls as a source, you would not know that the Unitarian Church of Harlem ever existed. Indeed, not many Unitarians outside of New York knew that there had once been an entrepreneurial effort to found and sustain a Unitarian congregation in the center of one of Black America's most important communities. The story of Reverend Egbert Ethelred Brown was all but forgotten at the time that I began serving as a UU minister back in 1976, except perhaps for a few longtime parishioners of his church or members of New York congregations who might have recalled hearing him preach during the 40s and the 50s. The Reverend Mark Morrison Reed found out about Brown when he was a student at Meadville Lombard Theological School researching early African American Unitarian Universalist history. He sought out Brown's family here in New York and was able to retrieve his personal papers from the family home. Brown became one of the subjects of Morrison Reed's thesis and then a book, Black Pioneers in a White Denomination, the first of several scholarly works that Mark has written about our faith's African American history. Now, our time today is not going to allow me to fully summarize the lengthy biography of Brown offered in that book, so I do commend it to you. Morrison Reed presents a balanced portrait of Reverend Brown and his 45 years of ministry in Jamaica and in New York. His personality, his ambitions, his failures, his frustrations, and his successes. For the first 20 years after Ethelred Brown arrived in New York and founded his church, this congregation's 6th minister, the Reverend Minot Simons, seems to have kept him at arm's length. It isn't hard to understand why, as we'll see later. Certainly culturally, politically, and theologically, Simons and Brown came from very different worlds. It wasn't surprising that Reverend Simons seems to have made no effort to build a relationship with Reverend Brown. But what was surprising was that Minot Simons' successor, the 7th minister of All Souls, the Reverend Lawrence Neal, considered him a friend and apparently developed a warm relationship with him. I first realized this might be true when I was having lunch with another UU scholar, the Reverend Adam Dyer, who was doing some research on Ethelred Brown. When he found out I would be spending time this past winter here at All Souls, Adam told me, I noticed there was a small article in the New York Times about a sermon Brown delivered at All Souls. and I became curious about how that came about. Adam's comment led me into Brown's archive at the Schomburg Library and into the papers of Lawrence Neal at Meadville Lombard's Wiggins Library. What I found out encouraged me to see if I could answer these questions. How did not only a professional relationship, but apparently a cordial friendship develop between Lawrence Neal and Ethelred Brown? Why was Neal's attitude towards his colleague in Harlem so different from that of his predecessor? How was Brown involved with and received by All Souls members? And was there an opportunity lost here to establish a thriving Unitarian church in Harlem as a missional outreach by All Souls? Or was this never a real possibility? At first glance, Ethelred Brown and Lawrence Neal appear to have very little in common. Their backgrounds were quite different. Brown was Jamaican, from a working class background. His family attended an Episcopal church in Montego Bay. He struggled with the recitation of the Athanasian Creed in church from an early age and realized that he was a Unitarian when he read William Ellery Channing's famous Baltimore sermon in his uncle's home when he was 11 years old. And he imagined becoming an ordained minister from an early age. He was even conditionally admitted to Meadville Lombard Theological School in his 20s, but he did not attend until 1907 at the age of 32. 3 years later, Brown would be ordained by Meadville Lombard at the time it was Meadville Theological School, on behalf of a small Unitarian group that was meeting at the time in Montego Bay. And he would be commissioned as a Unitarian missionary to Jamaica for the next 7 years, with inconsistent denominational support and frequent discouragements. Ethelred Brown pursued the dream of establishing a congregation and a career in his home country. Brown's story of passionate conversion to Unitarianism and overcoming significant obstacles to be ordained is in stark contrast to the journey of Lawrence Irving Neal to the Unitarian ministry and the pulpit of All Souls. He was born a Unitarian in 1885, which makes him 10 years younger than Brown. Neal's maternal line of Unitarians went back generations in New England. Raised in St. Louis, young Larry made his way back to New England to attend Harvard, where he was immersed in the Unitarian culture of the school. He began a career in business and moved to New York, working for a company that manufactured gypsum products. Then the First World War intervened, and Neal was drafted. He saw substantial combat in 6 campaigns as part of the 42nd Infantry Division. Returning to his career, and changed by his war experiences, Larry Neal began attending church. The membership records show him joining All Souls Church in 1921. He must have been a willing volunteer at All Souls. His career in sales made him a likely prospect for supporting the finances and the fundraising that the church required. He moved very, very quickly into the inner circle of lay leaders. Shortly after Dr. Simons was installed, Neal's career required him to move to Chicago, and so he was gone from New York and All Souls for a 2-year period. But when he returned to the city to take over as a sales manager for Atlantic Gypsum Company, Neal was almost immediately asked to consider serving on the Board of Trustees, where he would remain a member for 14 years. Without a doubt, Lawrence Neal was one of the most significant lay leaders in the history of this congregation, and I would suggest within American Unitarianism, well before he was asked to serve as the minister. Ethelred Brown's war during the years that Lawrence Neal was fighting abroad was not with the Kaiser, but with the men who led the American Unitarian Association. With diminished resources during wartime and lacking confidence in the reports that they heard from and about Brown, President Samuel Eliot and Vice President Louis Cornish withdrew grant support for Brown's mission in Jamaica. Despite a personally expensive trip back to Boston to plead his case, Brown came to realize that he would never receive the financial support necessary to establish a church, and had to turn to other employment as a teacher to feed his family. By 1920, as Lawrence Neal was settling back into his post-war life in New York and starting to become deeply involved in All Souls Church, Ethelred Brown had decided that the only place he could pursue his career would be in the United States. And he and his family moved to Harlem. Where else would you go as a black immigrant to the United States in 1920? By then, Harlem was swelling with new arrivals from the South every week, wave after wave of the Great Migration that had reached its peak between 1915 and 1918. There was a significant Caribbean population also emigrating to New York. This growing population was now disconnected from their roots and from their church communities. The new Negroes, they were calling themselves, with education, sophistication, and artistic leaders and a culture uniquely their own. Harlem was the place to be if you wanted to start a Unitarian church in a black community. It was also an obvious place for Brown to move as a Jamaican. In correspondence with me, Reverend Adam Dyer writes, Brown was not part of the Great Migration as much he was part of this movement of Caribbean blacks to Harlem in the wake of Marcus Garvey and the changing economic balance in Jamaica due to United Fruit and the collapse of the sugar industry. Garvey and Huber Harrison and Richard B. Moore and others of Jamaican ancestry were contemporaries of Brown. These Jamaican socialists invested in black uplift, in the new Negro, and in Caribbean independence. The Jamaican Progressive League, founded at this time, was central to these efforts and the sustainability of the Harlem Unitarian Church. Notably, not all of the Caribbean people who migrated to Harlem were unskilled laborers. They were educated, they had skills. Notably, Garvey, who was a journalist and a publisher, and Brown was fully literate in finance. Now, New York had many strong Unitarian congregations. Brown hoped that there would be an interest among them in supporting a black Unitarian minister leading a New Start congregation in Harlem. That was not what happened. Looking through our rearview mirrors at the 1920s, the years of the Harlem Renaissance, we see now this culture and its leaders as a pattern in history. But did white Unitarians in New York appreciate what was happening in Harlem? Certainly they were aware that the city's population and ethnic mix was changing. Most likely they wondered about the economic impact that these newest New Yorkers would be having on their own lives, and they wondered whether the neighborhoods below 125th Street would soon be changing colors. Mostly forgotten in the history of New York Unitarianism is that there was a white Unitarian church in Harlem until 1919, the year before Brown arrived. The Unity Congregational Society was founded in 1888 and built a church at Lenox Avenue and 121st Street. It was the fifth Unitarian congregation within New York City and was usually referred to as the Lenox Avenue Church. White flight from Harlem shrank the membership and forced the church to relocate. When Brown held his first service in Harlem on March 7th, 1920, at Lafayette Hall, the Lenox Avenue congregation had moved its services to Columbia University. And in 1921, they constructed a new building at 550 West 110th Street, near Broadway, and began calling themselves the West Side Unitarian Church. The Great Depression dealt a death blow to the congregation, and they ultimately merged into Community Church in 1931. At his first service in Harlem, Ethelred Brown announced that he would name his new congregation the Harlem Community Church, honoring the inspiration of Reverend John Haynes Holmes, because Holmes was the only colleague who reciprocated Brown's contacts and welcomed him. At that time, Holmes had become as much of an outsider to New York Unitarianism as Brown was. Holmes was the minister of the church formerly known as the Church of the Messiah, Unitarian. In the previous year, 1919, two momentous changes had taken place at the Church of the Messiah. First, their building burned to the ground, and second, Reverend Holmes convinced his congregation to withdraw from the American Unitarian Association and rename themselves the Community Church of New York. The withdrawal was political, theological, and cultural. Holmes had clashed with the leaders of the American Unitarian Association around his pacifist beliefs, resulting in a very public conflict on the convention floor of the National Conference of Unitarian Churches with the moderator of the time, former United States President William Howard Taft. But it wasn't just Holmes' left-leaning pacifist views that made him an outsider. He was also a child of the free religious movement that had arisen at the end of the 19th century in Unitarianism. And although an uneasy theological truce had been brokered back in 1894 that kept the National Conference together, ministers who leaned humanist and those who continued to embrace the liberal Christian heritage of Unitarianism were often personally as well as theologically far apart. All Souls ministers were in the camp of the liberal Christians. Minot Simons held firm Christian views and seems to have had little to do with Holmes or with the other Unitarian ministers in New York at all. Apparently, he didn't believe in pulpit exchanges or guest preaching from nearby ministers, preferring instead to seek out distinguished academics and denominational officials as guest preachers. In Safely Onward, Walter Kring relates the story of how antipathy towards Holmes' views within some lay leaders at All Souls was so strong that a request for his church to hold evening services at All Souls while they were without a church home after the fire became a matter of significant controversy. As far as outreach to black members or black ministers of any faith tradition by New York Unitarians of that time, the records that I've seen suggest little interest, except for Holmes and Community Church, which was actively seeking during the 1920s to become an interracial church. All Souls at that time was still meeting in their building at 20th Street and Park Avenue, a long way from Harlem. Minot Simons had come to this ministry from a role at the AUA headquarters directing the Department of Extension, or Church Growth. Simons knew about Brown's work in mainly two ways. First, through Brown's appeals to Unitarian ministers in New York for money to assist him in both his church work and to help see him through some personal financial difficulties. And second, through Simon's awareness that starting in 1925, there was a concerted effort by the chair of the American Unitarian Association's Ministerial Fellowship Committee to remove Brown from the roles of recognized Unitarian ministers. He may have known that Brown had taken up work as an elevator operator during his first years in Harlem in order to feed his family, since lack of funds meant the congregation could only employ him as a preacher twice a month. Up until 1926, Brown also earned some money being a speaker on behalf of the Socialist Party. For all these reasons, Reverend Simons apparently wanted little to do with Ethelred Brown. Brown endured personal family difficulties during these years involving his wife and his son's mental health, and that required expensive medical attention. In desperation, he solicited financial help from other Unitarian congregations and ministers, not only for the congregation, but for his personal financial crisis. And at some point, the officials at the American Unitarian Association began to agitate that Brown be removed from fellowship. In his recounting of Brown's struggles during the 1920s, Mark Morrison Reed acknowledges how difficult it must have been for colleagues to feel confident about Brown's prospects. But he also reflects on the ways that white supremacy assumptions and racism played their part in Brown being dismissed by the fellowship committee and ignored by all but Holmes. To be fair to Simons, the challenges facing All Souls Church during the 1920s were significant and have been well documented. By 1925, it was becoming clear that All Souls Church building had outlived its usefulness and that the congregation should move north. Despite the years of the Great Depression, that move to the corner of 80th and Lexington was accomplished by 1932. During the years that followed, the continuing consequences of the Depression meant that All Souls had financial problems. By this time, Lawrence Neal was in his second term as a trustee and was offering his business acumen to address these challenges. The Depression had brought Neal's career in the gypsum industry to an end. At the age of 51, he found himself at a crossroads, unemployed but financially secure enough to devote more time to his volunteer roles at All Souls. The timing was fortuitous because as Minot Simon's health began to deteriorate during these years, more and more of the administrative and financial oversight duties increasingly associated with moving and maintaining the church building were being assumed by Neal. In 1937, he was elected to his fourth term as a trustee of the church and essentially was functioning as executive director. There are no available records of correspondence or contact between Lawrence Neal and Ethelred Brown during the 1930s. This was a turbulent and difficult time for Brown personally, and the scope of this lecture will not allow more than a summary of the travails that he went through that Mark Morrison Reed has described in detail. His family life continued to be a struggle as his wife's mental health issues continued. His son committed suicide in 1929. During these years, Brown tried different strategies to attract more members to the church. Initially, he used the name Harlem Community Church, encouraged by the approach that Holmes was taking. In 1928, after a prominent Caribbean freethinker, political activist, and Harlem educator named Egbert Harrison had passed away, the congregation decided to name themselves after Harrison, Egbert Harrison Memorial Church. Political divisions around the Jamaican separatist leader Marcus Garvey resulted in conflicts among prospective members. The congregation experimented with different formats, from formal Protestant worship to humanist-oriented forums with minimal liturgy. The membership numbers remained in double digits, and financial support did not always equate with the recorded membership. Nevertheless, Brown continued his ministry even though the congregation was unable to provide him with a sustainable salary. With interventions by John Haynes Holmes and the American Civil Liberties Union, the AUA's Ministerial Fellowship Committee had restored Brown to full fellowship in 1932, but the association and local ministers still regarded him with suspicion because of his politics and his culture and his race. Finally, accepting that all of his entreaties to the AUA leaders and to colleagues in the tri-state area had fallen on deaf ears, Brown found employment as the office manager of a magazine founded by the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a magazine called The World Tomorrow, which was a leading voice for Christian, pacifist, and socialist views. Already well known within the political and religious leaders of Harlem and the resident Caribbean community, this role enabled Brown to broaden his connections with a network of national left-wing leaders within the white Christian community. The World Tomorrow's editors included theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, Disciples of Christ minister Kirby Page, the future Senator Paul Douglas, and during Brown's employment years, the nonviolence advocate and activist DeVere Allen. So at the same time that the white 51-year-old business executive Lawrence Neal became unemployed and a regular volunteer at All Souls, Ethelred Brown was a black 62-year-old white minister, similarly unemployed and volunteering his time to his own church. For a time, an inheritance from his father had helped sustain the Brown family, but that would run out. So Brown was forced to fall back on public assistance. In 1937, however, Brown's fortunes took a turn for the better when the administrative leadership of the American Unitarian Association changed. Frederick May Elliott, a minister that All Souls had hoped to attract to New York to their pulpit for some time, had been elected president of the AUA, and his staff team was a new generation of leaders who were less embedded in the culture of white supremacy that had been dominant in the association for decades. Dale DeWitt, the new AUA field representative in this region, was appalled when he realized that Reverend Brown was living on public assistance. And as he learned more about him, DeWitt could see that he had become a respected leader in his community. Mark Morrison Reed writes, denominational officials took note of his prominence in Harlem, where he was chair of the board of the Jamaica Benevolent Association, the president of the Jamaican Progressive League, a political organization that had helped secure self-rule for Jamaica, and an occasional speaker at Adam Clayton Powell's Abyssinian Baptist Church, one of the oldest and most prominent African-American churches in the North. Ethelred Brown had also testified before President Truman's Commission on Immigration, and he had traveled to Jamaica to represent the Jamaican Progressive League at the commission that was studying Jamaican independence. It was through DeWitt's leadership and outreach that a stipend of $50 a month was given to Brown until he reached his 65th birthday in 1940. He then became eligible for association support offered through designated funds devoted to pensions for impoverished ministers. For Brown, this modest financial security was the foundation that he needed to carry on. He decided in these new circumstances to change the name of his church once again, this time to the Harlem Unitarian Church, and the church would now be listed in the AUA's yearbook. Meanwhile, at All Souls, Minot Simon's health was worsening, while Lawrence Neal's growing role at All Souls was fostering his spiritual growth and religious understanding. After his business career ended, he enrolled for a year of personal study at Union Theological Seminary. When Reverend Simons became too ill to continue serving actively as All Souls minister in 1940, it was an easy decision for the congregation to turn to Neal and ask him to become acting minister. The church's search for a minister to succeed Dr. Simon is told in the All Souls history books and need not be repeated here. The congregation had set its sights high. When they could not get the minister that they really wanted, the AUA president, Frederick May Elliott, somebody must have asked the question, well, what's wrong with who we have now? Lawrence Neal had essentially been running the church for years and had been recognized formally for 2 years as the lead minister already. The problem was, he was not a Unitarian minister in fellowship. With an appeal to and support from AUA President Elliott, possibly feeling a little guilty that he had turned All Souls down, this problem was rectified with a special dispensation from the Fellowship Committee. The congregation ordained Lawrence Neal in June of 1941 and called him as senior minister in February 1942. The world had changed during these few months because of the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. So Lawrence Neal's years as All Souls 7th minister began with America at war. My own belief is that Lawrence Neal has been one of the most underappreciated of All Souls ministers, judging by the ways his story has been told. The pages devoted to him in Walter Kring's and Mariella Holst's books initially emphasized the story of the transition years when Neal was the power behind the throne of Reverend Simon's ministry. Little attention is paid to what his pastoral presence meant, or his preaching, or his leadership during the difficult years of the Second World War, and what all that meant to the congregation. Instead, in these chapters, the generous gifts of prominent lay leaders like the Baker family and Mrs. Albert Henry Wiggin are discussed. the Burn the Mortgage campaign that led to debt retirement by 1945 as the war ended, and that made possible the construction of Wigan House, are the singular events highlighted in Neil's long ministerial tenure. Half of the chapter devoted to Neil's ministry in Reverend Kring's Safely Onward is devoted to stories of important donors, although at the end of the chapter he devotes 2 pages to tributes to Dr. Neil upon his retirement and at the time of his passing. The All Souls 200 history gives a page to Neil, but bifurcates the story of his ministerial leadership between 2 chapters that are titled Changes for Women, All Souls, and the World, and The Kring Era. Despite 18 years of leadership, 5 of them behind the scenes, and 13 years as senior minister, a period equal to or surpassing the tenure of any of his predecessors since Henry Whitney Bellows, Lawrence Neil is given no era. Now, I hope that those of you listening to this lecture who have contributed to these histories will not take offense at these observations. Ministers who excel in administration and whose public persona are not as large as some other ministers in the history of any church are never going to get as much attention in the history books. And it is not unusual for such ministers to be remembered for permanent changes in the church building that occurred during their tenure, as much as being remembered for their preaching or teaching or pastoral ministry. The text of the plaque in the sanctuary, dedicated to Lawrence Neil, invites us to consider him in this way. Quote, "His teaching proclaimed the dignity of man, the importance of conviction, and the privilege of responsibility." This last phrase suggests a preaching and pastoral ministry that invited the members to reach beyond their place within the systems of race and class that defined the Upper East Side of New York and its neighborhoods. One aspect of Lawrence Neil's personality and leadership that has received little attention is his openness to the diversity of leaders and expressions that Unitarianism could have in the mid-20th century. Neil's formal ministry began in 1942 with an announced change in his attitude towards the pulpit that would merit coverage by the New York Times. The headline reporting on his first sermon as a called senior minister reads, "New minister tells policy of pastorate. Neil of All Souls will invite other Unitarians to the pulpit." Well, to our ears, this hardly sounds like a momentous announcement, but it was a big change. The way that the Times reporter focused on this as Neil's ministry began actually doesn't reflect the fact that this change had been underway for the preceding year, since Dr. Simons became too ill to preach. Simon's final sermon at All Souls was on the Sunday after Thanksgiving in 1940. His last year in the pulpit had been typical. He'd preached 30 Sundays, with Neil and lay leaders covering all but 2 of the others. The 2 guest ministers' Sundays were pulpit exchanges with friends of Dr. Simons. Perhaps Simons felt protective of the congregation's liberal Christian roots and traditional liturgy during the wave of humanist sentiments that was prevalent during the 1930s, or maybe he just loved to preach. During the 7 months of the next year, when Neil took over responsibility for worship leadership from Simons, Neil only preached 4 Sundays himself and covered 3 Sundays with prominent lay leaders from the congregation. 18 Sundays were given over to invited guest ministers, both nearby Unitarian ministers and prominent Unitarian ministers from other regions of the country. Well, that suggests to me that Neil wanted to open the doors and ears of his parishioners to different ways of being Unitarian during this time of transition. And Neil must have felt good about how the congregation received this variety of voices and preaching styles, because in September 1941, he announced in a pastoral letter his intention to, quote, "invite distinguished ministers of our fellowship to occupy the All Souls pulpit at frequent intervals, and also to provide opportunities from time to time for the more promising younger men to be heard," end quote. It isn't clear to me how much awareness Lawrence Neil had of the history of the Harlem Unitarian Church and its minister at the time he became senior minister at All Souls. The first correspondence we find between them in Reverend Neal's papers is dated February 1st, 1943, the year after Neal was formally called. Neal's opening of the pulpit to many different Unitarian voices certainly made it possible for him to open his heart and the doors of All Souls Church to Ethelred Brown as he got to know him. Perhaps Neal's openness arose from his military experience, where he had more opportunities to encounter African Americans than many white men of his class. That first piece of documented correspondence from Reverend Brown to Reverend Neal is an out-of-the-blue transactional request from Brown. Could he earn a little additional money by offering a lecture at All Souls about his personal journey, titled From Montego Bay to Harlem, A Pilgrimage of Faith? Could Neal schedule a date for him within the next month? Brown sends him the bulletin of the Harlem Church to show Neal their Sunday programs, including, I note, a guest appearance that month by Dale DeWitt. So Neal wrote back within 3 days, promptly offering Brown space for the lecture and discussing logistics. No further questions asked. He confirmed that he could not offer an honorarium, but approved Brown's request that a collection be taken. The exchange continued. Brown asked if Neal would attend the lecture and act as the chairman for the evening. Without hesitation, Neal cordially replied yes, he would. The morning after this lecture was delivered in the parish hall, Neal wrote immediately to Brown, quote, "Let me say how much I enjoyed your talk of last night. It not only gave me a lot of information about your life, about which I did not know, but more important, it set before me an example of fortitude and faith which was inspiring. All of those who were present were thrilled by the story. I hope that the road ahead will be more satisfying for you than the road you have trod." End quote. The cordial correspondence continues, with Brown enclosing the next month's church bulletin announcing a sermon series that Brown planned to preach. And Neal wrote back, impressed with a quote at the top of the bulletin, and wrote back to find out more about it. And then apparently he asked Brown to attend his service of installation as senior minister in March of 1943. Brown wrote back asking for his advice about how to robe. Later that month, Neal asked Brown to repeat his lecture once again because members who missed it would like a second chance to hear it. So then we have a chance to find out how sincere Neal's interest is in what Brown is doing in Harlem, because he receives a letter from Brown on April 13, 1943, inviting Reverend Neal to preach in Harlem at their regular service, which was held on Sunday evening. Neal wrote back within the week, and he accepted the invitation for May 23rd. Later that summer, Brown came by All Souls with a gift for the All Souls Church Library, a 2-volume bound Bible that had belonged to Brown's great-grandfather. This very personal gift for the church and Neal's response, encouraging regular meetings so that they can get to know each other better, indicates the growing friendship between the two ministers and their hopes for a similar growing relationship between the congregations. The letters in the archives for the two men do not give us a further clue as to whether or how these personal meetings regularly did take place, as Neal requested during the fall of '43. But more invitations from Brown are documented, including one to Neal for him to write a submission for the Amsterdam News about Unitarianism, which Brown was going to see if he could get published. And then another inquiring whether the All Souls Young People's Group could visit the Harlem Church to attend a special service directed at young adults particularly, and be part of the discussion that would follow. As the new church year 1944-45 began, Brown had concluded that the best strategy to ensure the survival and health of his congregation would be to make it an interracial congregation. This had been John Haynes Home's intention for Community Church as well. Brown may have been aware of a similar initiative by Howard Thurman at his congregation, the Fellowship of All Peoples in San Francisco. Brown announced his plans and hopes in individual letters to all the New York ministers. The letter to Reverend Neal is dated September 18, 1944, and is the longest one in the archive. He told Neil his trustees had approved this initiative, and their opening Sunday, October 1st, would seek to embody this new beginning. And he asked Neil if he could request his All Souls members to attend the Harlem Unitarian Church on that opening Sunday evening, and encouraged them to do so by attending himself and being part of the service on that day. Brown's long-term vision was eventually to have a co-ministry with one black and one white minister. He asked all the white ministers in New York to preach in Harlem at least once during the year ahead, and he hoped that white lay members who were already pledging to other New York congregations might join the Harlem Unitarian Church to embody an integrated congregation from the very beginning. Well, John Haynes Holmes quickly endorsed Brown's initiative and asked if he could be an honorary member. But his associate minister at Community Church, the Reverend Donald Santo Harrington, and his wife Vilma attended on that first Sunday in October, and they enrolled as members of the Harlem Unitarian Church. However, as the church year proceeded and Brown had some success in encouraging white guests to come and white people to join as members, he found that it discouraged rather than encouraged his black membership. The vision of an interracial congregation apparently was not as important to black residents of Harlem who might have been attracted to the Unitarian message. Mark Morrison Reed has reflected on the internal racial, ethnic, and class dynamics of the black community in Harlem, with which Brown had to struggle, and was ultimately unsuccessful in overcoming, as he tried to realize his vision of a community church that was fully integrated across all of these lines. Reverend Neil had responded cautiously to Brown's letter announcing his vision and asking for Neil's leadership and participation. He wrote back expressing his own, candidly expressing his own lack of knowledge about the Harlem community and his inability to judge whether the time and circumstances were right for such an undertaking. He suggested that Brown reach out to President Elliott at the AUA to ask for advice and support. And he didn't immediately accept the invitation to lead a delegation from All Souls to attend on that first Sunday in October. He wrote, "Please do not think by this suggestion I am throwing cold water on your proposal. Rather do I wish to be thoroughly informed, so that whatever part I have in the procedure may be based on a complete understanding and a natural enthusiasm arising from that understanding." End quote. Well, apparently Neil ultimately declined the invitation to attend and participate on that 1st of October date, because his next letter to Brown concerns the details for a service he has agreed to lead in the next month. In a thank you note written the next day to Neil, Brown apologized to him for a lighter attendance than he had hoped for, but he celebrated the fact that the church had enrolled 5 new members during October, 3 of them white and 2 of them black. Brown was undaunted by this slow start and the mixed results of his announced efforts to integrate the church during 1944-45. He boldly announced a capital campaign to construct a building for the church in the spring of 1945. Mark Morrison Reed believes that a wiser path might have been to move out of the rental arrangement with the YMCA and arrange a long-term lease in a storefront, which was a familiar path for entrepreneurial congregations in Harlem to take. Brown was determined instead to follow the pattern of other Unitarian churches and construct their own building. The occasion which would kick off this Building Fund capital campaign would be the 25th anniversary of the founding of the congregation, March 11th, 1945. Reverend Brown may not have known how terribly awkward this timing was for any substantial contributions to such a campaign from All Souls Church or its members. That same spring, All Souls Church members were told that the outstanding debt on their building had reached a point of crisis in the negotiations with the Franklin Savings Bank. The story of the Burn the Mortgage campaign, which Reverend Neil and the board initiated in response to the crisis, has been told in detail in various All Souls histories. We can presume that Neil had to devote himself to many private meetings with potential member donors to kickstart this campaign. This was happening just as Brown was planning his celebratory 25th anniversary service and inviting Lawrence Neal to be the featured clergy speaker, accompanied by the full All Souls Choir. Numerous letters back and forth make it clear this date is not going to work for Neal or the choir. But then Brown gets a lucky break. United States Senator and later U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice Harold Burton had accepted Brown's invitation to offer the address at this service in his role as moderator of the American Unitarian Association. But a change in his calendar had made the actual anniversary date impossible for Burton to make. So all the plans were adjusted to 2 weeks later. Brown wrote back again to Neal, candidly referring to his hope that having not only white clergy participating, but white Unitarians attending this special service would support his goal of an integrated church. Neal wrote back, again declining to come on that evening, referencing other commitments that he had already made within the congregation on this rescheduled Sunday evening date. However, Neal countered with another plan. He invited Brown to bring his congregation to All Souls for the Sunday morning service on March 25th, Palm Sunday, where the Harlem Church anniversary would be recognized and where Brown would read the scripture lesson and offer your own original prayer. Brown followed through on this invitation, and the evening service did go forward with Reverend Lathrop from Brooklyn as the featured clergy speaker. The following summer of 1945 was the first year that Reverend Neal invited Brown to preach at All Souls during the summer series of guest ministers. Now, I believe that the summer series was another Neal innovation. Before his ministry, formal services were not held in the summer months. Apart from one season, Brown was a regular summer preacher from 1945 to 1954. This decision to give Brown a regular invitation to the All Souls pulpit furthered not only their professional relationship, but their personal one as well. As Neal had become more familiar with Brown's preaching during these years, he could see that it compared favorably with any of the nationally known Unitarian ministers and regional colleagues that Neal routinely invited to the pulpit. So further invitations followed. Neal invited Brown to attend the dinner in October of 1945 in which the success of the Burn the Mortgage campaign was celebrated. Brown was encouraged and felt that the time might be right now for a big push towards the new building that he envisioned. Neal continued to offer his personal support. He arranged for All Souls to host several concerts of music in support of this new phase of the Building Fund campaign. The first on January 27, 1946, with a second concert 2 years later, and a third in 1952. On May 5, 1946, there was a rally for the Building Fund, held with Reverend Neal as the principal speaker in the company of Reverend Lathrop from First Unitarian in Brooklyn, and again AUA President Frederick May Elliott. In the following year, 1947, there was another spring event for the Building Fund supported by the area Unitarian ministers, and a banquet was held for Egbert Ethelred Brown in his honor, hosted by Reverend Walter Royal Jones, who served the congregation in Flatbush at that time. That same year, Brown was featured in a lead article in the Christian Register entitled, "I Have Two Dreams," in which he called for Unitarians to realize the dream of integrated congregations, not only his own personal dream for a congregation he would lead, but also his second dream for an American Unitarian Association equally accessible and staffed by black and white members and leaders together. Brown became a regular and noted figure at AUA annual meetings and was asked to be a speaker. Notably, even with the attention Brown and the Harlem Church were receiving from the AUA and from President Frederick May Elliott at that time, the AUA was not willing to give direct support to this building fund. Did they have the capacity? I believe so. These very years were the founding years of the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Church in Charlottesville, Virginia, a congregation I once served. I know that President Elliott was deeply committed to having a memorial church in Thomas Jefferson's hometown, and that the AUA supported the founding of that church, the purchase of that land, and the construction of that building during the very years that the church in Harlem was asking for the same kind of support. Lawrence Neal continued over the course of these 5 years following the war in his personal support for the building fund, acting as an agent for collecting donations, running them through All Souls accounts, and sending them along to the Harlem Church. Neal also made a special effort to encourage All Souls members to attend the second rally in support of the building fund, held on May 2nd, 1948. In a letter sent to all board members, officers, and presidents of the Alliance, the Laymen's League, and the Simon's Guild, Neal wrote passionately about hopes for this event that he would share with Brown. Right now, wrote Neal, he needs a demonstration of support, not merely in dollars, but in visible evidence that white people are interested. It is so easy to give lip service to the need for breaking down racial prejudice. It is much more important to give practical exhibitions of our goodwill. While Reverend Neal was comfortable using letters like these to invite All Souls members to make contributions to the building fund, it's not clear whether he used any influence he had with wealthy All Souls donors to encourage major gifts to the Harlem Church, even though during these years the financial crisis associated with the mortgage had abated. The archive of correspondence for both ministers contained thank you letters for gifts and some fan letters from what I presume to be Brown's white supporters and likely donors, some of whom are likely in All Souls membership records. Sadly, however, after 3 years of special events and solicitations, the Harlem Church Building Fund reported that it had only reached 10% of its necessary goal. Ethelred Brown suffered a second profound loss in his immediate family in November of 1947, when his wife died. His colleagues sent their condolences, and Neal offered a poem at the memorial service. During these post-war years, the relationship between Ethelred Brown and Lawrence Neal matured from the formality of their earliest correspondence to a warm informality. Letters and personal notes started to be addressed to Ethelred and signed Larry, and vice versa. In December 1948, Larry invited Ethelred to co-officiate a memorial service for an African-American Unitarian newly moved to New York, whose family were likely prospective members. In 1951, Larry asks Ethelred if he could be on call to field a church wedding for him coming up on August 4th. The bride and groom are two of our young people, he wrote, Anthony Bearer and Maria Philoma. Anthony had apparently come to know Brown through his speaking engagements at the church and had introduced Brown at a talk that he offered to the Simon's Guild in 1949. Neal felt sure that the couple would be very pleased to have him as their officiant. During these years, there are several personal notes about poems and books, about Brown's joy when new members joined the church, and about mutual praise for sermons exchanged. There is also a personal request from Ethelred to Larry for a loan of $100 with a schedule for repayment proposed. Larry readily agrees, and Ethelred makes the payments on time, acknowledged by a note from Larry indicating his pleasure at being able to help. In the fall of 1949, Brown decided he should write a history of the Harlem Unitarian Church for posterity while memory and strength allowed. At the end of the history, he offers sincere appreciation to supporting ministers and congregations, naming 3 in particular. First, Reverend John Haynes Holmes, his first collegial friend in New York. The second, Reverend John Howland Lathrop, and First Unitarian in Brooklyn, for continued interest and practical help through many years, a relationship that I think deserves more scholarly study. And then we find these words: to All Souls Unitarian Church of New York, which has indeed become our mother church, and to its minister, Reverend Lawrence Neal, for the many things done by him in behalf of our work. Ultimately, the bonds of friendship would be tested when Neil reached a limit and an end to his ability to continue to endorse Brown's vision for a permanent building. On October 7th, 1952, we find Neil writing to Brown declining his request that he chair a new fundraising initiative to raise $40,000 with a campaign that would be celebrating the 40th anniversary of Brown's ordination in support of the new building in Harlem. In framing his negative response, Neil wrote at some length about the fundraising challenges he faced at All Souls. "Next Sunday at long last, ground will be broken for Wigan House," he wrote, and went on to describe All Souls' plans to raise the remaining funds required for this new building, even as the construction was beginning. Neil makes it crystal clear that the church will not contribute to this new campaign for Harlem, and he cannot chair it. And he further discourages Brown from making his 40th anniversary of ordination event into a fundraiser. Neil also corresponds with other ministers in the area, telling him about his decision to be present at the event celebrating Brown for his 40 years of ordained service, but to refrain from inviting All Souls members and donors to be involved in making the event a big fundraiser. Well, the 40th anniversary celebration was held on November 30th, 1952, with AUA President Frederick May Elliott as the principal speaker. Reverend Neil and other colleagues attended and spoke warmly of Brown, and an offering was taken up which added $700 to the building fund. The correspondence back and forth leading up to the event indicates Brown was disappointed that this last proposal for major fundraising had not been supported. He understood that this was likely his last chance to realize the dream of a Harlem Unitarian Church building. His report to Reverend Neil on the proceeds of this event and the total in the building fund of a little more than $3,000 is the last letter from Brown that we find in Neil's archive. As Ethelred Brown passed his 75th birthday, he had become a respected elder in the Harlem community. When his friend Langston Hughes, an atheist who was deeply interested in religion, wanted to include Unitarians in a series that he was writing for the Chicago Defender magazine about African Americans' faith experiences, he turned to Brown to ask him to write that statement. Brown remained active in the Jamaican expatriate community, raising money for the People's National Party, and was honored by an invitation from the Prime Minister of Jamaica, Norman Manley, in 1952, to be his guest at a ceremony back home, recognizing his contributions. By the early 1950s, Brown seems to have resigned himself to the possibility that his congregation would not survive his own passing from the scene. Nevertheless, he continued to preach and participate in Unitarian events until his last illness. Brown's final sermon at All Souls was preached on August 22nd, 1954, and was called, "Let Us Be Practical." The title gives no hint of the powerful call Brown offered the congregation that day to stay engaged with a wide range of current challenges facing the city and the world. He reflected first on the value of practicality, but then skillfully led his listeners through all the ways that political leaders who wish to preserve the status quo quietly advise or loudly exhort reformers to slow down, be patient, be practical. He takes up the issue of public transportation in New York, which was a hot topic in the same year as the Montgomery bus boycott. And the controversy here was about the fact that the transit system did not hire black drivers. Brown rails against corruption among politicians in the city of New York. He then turns to the most practical spiritual advice that religions around the world have offered for thousands of years in different ways, the Golden Rule, and applies that to the nuclear arms race currently in the news. That next winter, Reverend Neil announced his plan to retire from the ministry of All Souls in the summer of 1955. A year after that announcement, he fell ill and died on Easter Eve, 1956. Ethelred Brown's health had declined as well during that same year, 1955, and he too died in 1956, just 6 weeks before Lawrence Neal. What can we learn from this reconstructed history of a relationship between two congregations and two ministers, one predominantly upper-class white and one predominantly immigrant black? So many of the underlying dynamics in the early years of Ethelred Brown's story are ones that we recognize from our UU history of aspiration towards multicultural congregations. A trained Unitarian minister in fellowship with the AUA undertakes a rare entrepreneurial effort to create the first predominantly black but integrated Unitarian congregation in North America. Because he is an immigrant with a foreign accent and a dark black skin, white leadership discounts his chances for success, and the black elite in Harlem receives him cautiously. Through interventions and initiatives by a small number of influential white supporters, the AUA offers just enough funding to be able to say they are helping the effort, but too little to make success likely. Noblesse oblige, but only to a point. Personal and family issues are scrutinized and weaponized. Old tropes about black people being morally and intellectually inadequate to the challenges of leadership seem to be influencing white leaders' efforts to discourage the black leader from pursuing his career in a white world. Ultimately, an intervention by a white savior changes the black leader's fortunes, and this intervention begins to open up new doors for Unitarian leaders in New York to engage with Ethelred Brown's vision. Our UU anti-racism work and education in recent decades has helped us to recognize that my metaphor of opening doors refers to three challenges, both then and now, in growing Unitarian Universalism across racial and cultural lines. One door has to do with what it means to have authentic relationships, professional and personal, among white and black leaders and members within our movement. A second door is what cross-cultural engagement among Unitarians of different backgrounds who share a common faith truly means, and whether it's possible for any majority white church culture to look critically at itself and question its presumptions. Behind a third door is the challenge of naming the power differential that comes from inherited social status, wealth, and authority, and whether power can be equalized while pursuing common endeavors. Three Unitarian ministers, white Unitarian ministers, Holmes, Lathrop, and Neal, approached these doors that opened in their relationship with the Harlem Unitarian Church during the years around the Second World War, and they considered walking through them with partial success. My story today has been about Lawrence Neal's efforts, and I hope that more work could be done exploring the connections between Brown and Holmes and Brown and Lathrop. What I can say about Lawrence Neal is that when he began to engage with Ethelred Brown, it was with an open heart and a cautious mind. How much of the early years of their relationship was professional and transactional, we can only speculate. Within a few years of regular contact, however, it is clear that Reverends Brown and Neal had become Egbert and Larry to each other, and that their genuine mutual regard is readily apparent. I believe Lawrence Neal had a genuine desire to see Brown's vision of a multiracial church in Harlem succeed, but even as their relationship deepened, Neal could never get over his initial presumption that it was an improbable project. Neal used his role and influence to encourage his members to join him when he was preaching in Harlem, and when mutual invitations were extended to bring members of the two congregations together. He brought Brown into All Souls regularly over 11 years in many different roles, as a speaker, a preacher, and a teacher. He referred potential members to Brown's church and did not discourage joint membership. What we do not know, and what I suspect Neal did not do, is learn more about the cultures of those who were drawn to the Harlem Church. Jamaican immigrants, native black New Yorkers, left-leaning multiracial humanists. That was a door he could not enter. Rather than being a partner, he remained more like a tourist or a social worker, paying a visit to a place he hoped he could help become a community more like the one he had come from, All Souls, rather than become the community that the Harlem congregation wanted to be. And that brings us to a third door, which I don't believe Neil tried to walk through. And that is the door which invites you to take risks. Neil was never able to risk commitments of his time, his leadership authority, and the financial capacity that he could influence or muster to help the Harlem Unitarian Church achieve financial stability, or to form a partnership with All Souls based on equity and mutual respect. There was once a seed in Harlem of a multiracial, multicultural Unitarian Church. Those who had the resources to help nurture and grow that seed did not do all that they could to help that seed to grow. It was an opportunity lost, and we are all the poorer for that loss all of these years later. With that said, I find the inspiration from the untold story from All Souls history that I have presented today to be moving, and I hope that you will too. With the benefit of what we have learned from 70 years of racial justice work in Unitarian Universalism, from the civil rights years to the Black empowerment years to the Black Lives Matter years, we could treat this story as a piece of critical history and lament what didn't happen, what might have happened, and decry the failures of our ancestors. I prefer to hold this story as a part of this congregation's antiquarian history, a time when leaders and members of two very different congregations could see that they shared a personal and common life through an affirmation of roots, traditions, and identity as Unitarians. That is the definition of antiquarian history that I offered you as this paper began. It is a worthy undertaking in the writing of history and in the living of our days right now. In his conclusion to his book, Black Pioneers in a White Denomination, where Ethelred Brown's story was first told, Mark Morrison Reed offered words which reminded us why we must continue to meet the ongoing challenge of creating multicultural, liberal religious community. And so I will close with them. Mark writes, to move forward in this direction as a denomination, we first need to ask ourselves, why? And I think there is only one authentic answer. For yourself. For yourself, because you will feel more comfortable in a multicultural, multiracial denomination. For yourself, because being part of an inclusive movement is more consonant with the self-image you hold of yourself as a liberal, religious person. For yourself, so that the piece of you which feels guilty or angry about what we aren't can stop feeling guilty and let go of the anger. For those who choose this direction, know that you are not the first to make this choice. Others have shown the way, but opening the door must be a choice, and sustaining the call takes effort. It will be risky, difficult, and painful, yet we accept such realities when we believe that the effort will help us become the people and the places that we yearn to be. May it be so.